My name's Ian Richardson. I'm the writer of God's Triangle, which we're attempting to turn into a film and a book. I'm aged 73, and the prompting questions will come from my wife Rosemary, who's been helping out with the film project.
What is your connection to Florence Cox and to Hedley Sutton?
Well, Florence Cox was my great aunt, the sister of my grandfather, and Hedley Sutton was the brother of my grandmother.
And how did you stumble on the story that you have named God's Triangle?
Well, it was by accident, really. I'm very keen on genealogy. In fact, all my family is interested in this. But I was talking to my mother one day and she dug out a box of photographs. And we were going through them all and we came across this one that had a group of, and in that group I recognised my grandfather, but I didn't recognise anyone else. So I said to my mother, who are those people? And she went through them all, and my eye was caught by a fairly tall woman standing at the back, and I asked her who that was, and I was told with a touch of embarrassment that this was Auntie Florrie. And I said, well, I've never heard of Auntie Florrie before. And my mother responded by saying, well, of course, we didn't talk about Auntie Florrie. The family didn't discuss her very much. And being a journalist, I was intrigued. And I said, well, why not? And she didn't want to tell me, really. But the more I pressed her, the more she didn't want to tell me, the more interested I was in trying to find out. So that got me started. She talked about my great aunt, Aunt Florrie, as being a missionary and of having a marriage that went wrong, and so that really got us started.
And when did you seriously start researching the story?
Well, it's more than 10 years ago, and originally we started it as a family history exercise. It was only after we got into the story that I suddenly realised, when my wife and I were talking one day, that she was right, that this had a great film potential.
What was the attitude of your family to doing a feature film and a book about Florence Cox's life?
Well, some were excited, but some were quite annoyed. My own mother was rather anxious because she was very, very fond of Hedley Sutton, her uncle, and so she didn't want the family's reputation trashed. There was an uncle of mine who was totally hostile, hated the idea, said I shouldn't do it, I should leave sleeping dogs to lie. But others who were slightly edgy at first came round, and on the whole, as the years have progressed, I think the family's fully supportive of the project.
What was the most difficult part of the story to uncover?
The court case, I guess, because my great aunt was divorced in an annulment divorce in the Supreme Court in Melbourne, and when I first made some inquiries, because I knew she'd been divorced, it was quite a simple process to get the divorce document, the certificate. But when I said, well, why can't I see the files? I was told, well, the files were closed for all time. And that seemed to me to be a bit curious. So I started making some inquiries, and I found out that court cases, divorces in that period, this was 1919, they were mostly public. Most of them, if they were the slightest bit juicy, were reported in great detail in the Melbourne Truth. The Melbourne Argus also used to cover them. So I was incredibly curious why. And it took me 18 months of battle with very friendly people at the Supreme Court, but nonetheless determined not to let me see these files because they'd been marked closed for all time. Eventually, when I got so frustrated, I said to the prothonotary, well, look, I'm not going to give up on this. I am going to get a barrister and I'm going to really take it to court and fight it. And he said, well, you don't have to. You can do it yourself. So a few days later, I fronted up before Mr. Justice Barry Beach in private chambers, made my case, and 15 minutes later I was allowed to photocopy the documents. But that was only after 18 months of battle.
And were you surprised by what you eventually discovered?
Well, in some ways I was surprised, but other ways not, because in a way it was a confirmation of some of the things that I suspected. But I guess I was surprised to see some of the detail, the medical detail, concerning my great aunt.
Why was so much effort expended in suppressing the scandal?
It's a difficult one to answer, but I reckon as the more I've researched this story, the more I've come to the conclusion that it was a financial reason. Now, obviously, what happened with my great aunt was hugely embarrassing. It was hugely embarrassing to the church because there was a scandal involved. If it had just simply been a marriage breakdown, it wouldn't have been so bad. But to have another missionary involved in the triangle, which is where God's triangle got its name from, was very, very difficult for everybody. But I still think that the real reason was that the funds were drying up for missionaries, particularly during the First World War, which was when these events took place. And that was massive. The financial problems are hinted at it all the way through the documents that I've seen. And I reckon that they thought that if this got into the Melbourne Truth and became a scandal, funds would dry up.
Did you ever meet Hedley Sutton?
Well, no, as far as I can remember, I never met him. But it's really interesting that I've read an awful lot of stuff about him and I've read an awful lot of stuff that he's written, and I almost feel as though I do know him. I mean, he was obviously very, very austere man, very, very old-fashioned. I mean, he wore clothes that seemed to belong to people decades before. I think he was self-centered. One of the more interesting documents that we went through was his so-called life story, which he had written as a kind of love letter to the woman who later became his wife. And that was fascinating. The story itself was boring, but what it told us about Hedley Sutton was interesting. Although he was from a large family, the other members of the family hardly ever got mentioned, and he clearly felt a bit put upon by his parents who'd failed to support him as he felt they should when he went through his college training and his university period. I mean, one thing I should say about Hedley is that he was an exceptionally intelligent man. He stood out in the family. He was a classics scholar. He was a classics teacher, a classics master at 20, and a wonderful linguist, and obviously a man of exceptional intelligence.
Can you explain Florence's medical condition?
Florence had something called CAIS, C-A-I-S, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Now it's a very unusual complaint, very rare. In Britain, for instance, where I've done quite a bit of research, I know that there are only 50 women who've had this. I mean, I try to keep it in simple terms, is that every fetus starts off life as a female, but those with XY chromosomes progressively during the pregnancy become male. Now, if something goes wrong, and it did certainly in my great aunt's case with had case, was that the female organs were removed as you would normally get as a child, as a boy develops in the womb, but what went wrong was that the testosterone, which should have been bringing on the penis and the testicles and all the other male aspects of a body, might as well have been mineral water for all it did. And so what happened was that Florrie was born as appearing to be a woman. She grew up thinking she was a woman, and in many respects she was a woman, but she was intersex. And I have to say that intersex is not intersex people are not hermaphrodites. In her case, she had all the appearances and behaviour, and she clearly thought like a woman, but she wasn't one because she had no vagina, and so she couldn't have children, and she couldn't have sex.
How do you feel about the main characters in God's Triangle, and who were the guilty parties?
Well, I have a great deal of sympathy for everyone, some more than others, of course. I mean, my great aunt was clearly a very, very nice woman. She was deeply religious, of course, otherwise she wouldn't have gone to India as a missionary. But she did clearly love Frank Pace, and it must have been an utter disaster for her when she found out about her condition. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Frank Pace as well, because all my research has suggested that he was a very nice man. Olga Johnson, the third woman in the triangle, well, I think she was a tough cookie, but it appears when she first went to India as a missionary, she was a much more different person. And what I've read about her and what I've read that she wrote in magazines was very charming stuff. But she was determined to get her man, and her man was Frank Pace. And so you have to you have to think that she was a guilty person, but not as, you know, she was caught up in India in a very difficult situation. Hedley Sutton, well, he was fine. He was a nice, very austere man, but he was completely out of his depth. He didn't understand what married life was about. I don't think he understood people terribly well. So it's a difficult one, as I say.
Significance of the title, God's Triangle.
Well, it came about quite simply because there were three people in this, and they were all missionaries, and there was my great aunt Florrie, there was Frank Pace, and there was Olga Johnston. So it seemed to me that was a good title, God's Triangle. But I grew up in a religious family, and some other members of my family who are also religious pointed out to me that it could be seen as the Holy Trinity, Father, Son and Holy Ghost. And I thought, well, that's not incompatible with what I've got in mind for this story. So there you have it.
And can you explain or explicitly tell us about the scandal to which you refer?
Yes, well, it's an extraordinary thing, really, that a woman would get engaged and married, not knowing the basics of her own body. And in those days, back around the time of the First World War, when couples went out, they were chaperoned everywhere. Then when Florrie and Frank got engaged, Frank immediately went abroad to India as a missionary. And so the engagement, the period when people really got to know each other a bit better within the limitations of these social mores at the time, she didn't have that. So she also grew up in a family where sex was an absolute taboo. And the fact that she had no vagina, no pubic hair, and obviously no periods, did not seem to be an issue to be discussed. And she went into this marriage honestly, turned up in Calcutta, a month later got married, and they went off on a honeymoon, and tragedy, there could be no consummation of the marriage. Well, the church in its own wisdom had decided not only to not send Florrie to India with Frank when they got engaged, because, hey, they couldn't be trusted, could they? He was sent to India with a missionary nurse whose name was Olga Johnston, and she was obviously a passionate woman, and they were thrown together learning the language of the predominant language there, which was Bengali. So they became very close in the 2 years of the engagement, and we don't know when that happened, but there was an affair at some point. And of course, Frank and Florrie, their marriage was a sham, and it was bound to end in disaster because of not only of what they couldn't do, but they didn't know anything. The condition that Florrie had was not identified until after her death. Has that got any more? The actual scandal was when the affair that Frank was having with Olga Johnston was uncovered. Now, I've done an awful lot of research into this, and I'm not entirely sure how the scandal broke or when it broke, but certainly there was a period when Olga Johnston was back here in Melbourne, where this interview is being recorded, and she was feted. She was regarded as a great person, and she was out travelling around Victoria raising funds for the missionary service. And there was not a hint for 3 months that she was anything but a feted, highly respected member of the missionary service. Then 3 months later, she disappeared. She became a non-person. And next thing we know is, looking through the minutes that I've discovered, that Frank and Florrie were fired, Olga was fired, and they were all coming back to Melbourne. And that's when the big cover-up started, where the church was determined never to let this story get out. And I think it was a collaboration between the Freemasons, who were all the key figures in the scandal, were all Freemasons. The church was obviously very anxious not to see its reputation destroyed, and somehow they got the press not to report it either. As for the judiciary, I don't know, but still someone must have made the decision that this was not going to be an open court case for the divorce. Am I shouting?
You're on.
I think it must have been an absolutely terrible situation for both Frank and Florrie, but particularly for Florrie. I mean, you just imagine she's turned up in India to marry the man she loves, and it's a disaster. She doesn't get the support that she should get because it's very clear that Hedley Sutton wouldn't have been the man to help her out. And not long after they moved there, they were moved to such a remote part of India where there were very, very few European women there. Florrie would still have been struggling with the language, and although there's no suggestion that she didn't mix in with the local population and do the best for it, I mean, it must have been desperately lonely for her. When she came back, well, I think that she was really upset. I mean, obviously it was a tragedy for her, but I think she wanted to stay married. And it may seem bizarre to some people, but I've talked to other people who are case sufferers, if you can use the word sufferers, and because of the more enlightened age we live in, they are able to make their marriage work. I mean, one woman said to me when I questioned her about the situation, she said, well, you know, there's more than one way of satisfying someone you love. And you know, that is interesting. But no, I don't think that Florrie wanted to be divorced. Whether she was resentful about it, I don't know, but she must have been pretty unhappy.
In society at the time, wouldn't she have been called upon to explain the divorce?
Well, the other aspect was that because of the cover-up, it was a matter that wasn't discussed. I have what I believe is the only surviving picture of their marriage in Calcutta, and I've only got that photograph because it was held by a distant cousin, and that distant cousin's family was never told about the divorce, whereas those close members of the family who were told about the divorce, they destroyed everything. The church destroyed almost everything. So people sort of must have known there was something going on and something had been going on. But it's one of the astonishing things of this story for me, that someone could have eradicated a whole chunk of their life and that nobody seemed to know about it.
You mentioned an incident.
Yes, well, it says that the documents that we have found, the ones that the church didn't manage to destroy, referred to as the incident. Now, we don't know what it is, but my guess is that at one point Olga was pregnant. My guess is that probably someone found a love letter that Frank had sent to her or she had sent to Frank. But it could be, there are a lot of other things that it could have been. I mean, one of the most infuriating things, one of the things that I will regret to the day I die is that my researcher found a man who was in a nursing home in Brisbane. He was over 100 years old. He was a missionary in the same patch that Hedley Sutton and Frank and Florrie were stationed, and he knew the story. My researcher wrote to him, said, would he explain what happened? And he wrote back and said, this story is going to die with me. I didn't have time to go up to Brisbane to see him. I had to go back to England. By the time I got back, it was too late. He died, because I reckon that if I'd got to talk to this man, I would have been able to find out what had happened. So what happened to Olga and Frank after the divorce? Well, that's another mystery. I mean, I know what happened to them. I know where they went. I know what they did. But what I do not understand is how they managed to get a divorce through the Supreme Court in Melbourne in 3 months. How astonishing is that back in 1919? But at any rate, having got the divorce, both Frank and Olga went straight back to Calcutta, where they were married in a civil ceremony. Frank then became the general manager for Hume Pipes, which was the India division of the Australian company of the same name. And he managed that company for something like 6 years, I think, before coming back to Australia to work for the Australian division. Olga, well, I believe she had several miscarriages, but she did eventually have a son when she came back to Melbourne. She did not ever attend church again, to my knowledge, and she was one tough cookie as far as I can establish. She slept with a revolver under her pillow for most of her life, even when she was back in Australia. Not many women I know have ever felt the need to sleep with a gun under their pillow. God, you're going to have a bit of mashing up to do here, aren't you?
I don't know how many women you... What evidence is there that Florrie really loved Frank?
Well, I think there's quite a bit of evidence, but 2 anecdotes I think are significant. One was that she turned up at a church event and tracked down one of Frank Pace's relatives, and she came up to him and handed him a book and said, "This is from someone I loved. I think you would like to have it back. Please pass it on. Thank you." And she disappeared into the crowd before this other person realised what it was. Another occasion was when a missionary was going off to somewhere or other, I assume it was India, and there was a farewell event, and Florrie turned up at that. And she approached the woman and said, "Are you sure he really loves you?" And I think that's rather sad. I think it's proof that Frank really did matter to her.